What's up, guys? I wanted to do a bit of a different video. I've been really into graphic work since I started my YouTube channel, and I wanted to kind of show you guys what I've learned, sort of what I've taught myself. I didn't take any classes or anything like that. This is basically what I've learned from just using Gimp over and over again. Gimp is an open source image manipulation or graphic art program, sort of like Photoshop, but it's 100% free. So if you don't have Gimp and if you're doing a lot of graphic work with something else, maybe consider downloading and using Gimp. So today, what I want to show you guys is basically 3D text or perspective text, whatever you want to call it. This is something that I've been working on recently, and I've been giving it a bunch of practice and everything like that. So let me know what you guys think. Hopefully this helps some of you guys out who are just now starting a YouTube channel, just started using Gimp, and want to know how to make 3D text similar to a bunch of different YouTubers that you might see. So you want to go to File, New. The size of a YouTube thumbnail is 1280 by 720. In our resolution, we just go to 3000. In our background color, I like to use transparency. Now, another thing I like to do is go to Image, Guides, New Guide by percent. Little window pops up for me right here, and I do horizontal 50 and vertical 50. This basically makes sure that anything you do can be snapped to perfect center. So if we crop our layer to the image size, or to alpha in this case, if you select your little move tool, then you can center whatever it is. So that's why I like to use guides, and that's pretty much it. So let's go ahead and undo that. Now we're gonna make a new layer. You can right click and select new layer, or you can just hit the new layer button. Our width is gonna be the same as our canvas size. So it's gonna be 1280 by 720. Layer fill type, you can do foreground or background color, which will either be in this case black or white. You can do generic white, or you can do transparency. I like to just keep it at transparency. So now we have two visible layers, even though they're transparent. We have our background, which I like to just turn off to just sort of be there, and then we have our new layer. Now our new layer, we can do anything we want. We could fill it with black, we could fill it with white, we can do a gradient of white to black, whatever you want to do. So that's your new layer. Show layer boundary basically is your little black and yellow ants along the side. So if you take that away, there's no layer boundary. You can also take away the guides. You can show a grid. You can also make the grid whatever you want. You can make it red. You can make the width and the height different sizes for basically for more precision. But just for this example, we're going to not show grid. We're going to show our guides. Let's see, we're gonna show layer boundary just because that's what I like to have on. Now another thing I like to do is snap to canvas edges, making sure that if we decide to do a full page gradient, to make sure that it's basically a perfect gradient, if you want to call it, you can snap to the edges of the canvas just like that, and it'll just snap to the side like that. We're gonna go ahead and undo that. Now with 3D text, you can do it two ways. The most basic way, you're gonna wanna go to your text tool. We're not gonna use sans, we're gonna use, I really like American Captain. We're gonna change the size to, let's just do 200 for the purposes of the example. Use editor, we're gonna leave off. Anti-aliasing, we're gonna leave on. Hinting, this is basically sort of like text smoothing. If you don't do this, it might be a little jagged around the edges, I've found. If it's different for you, let me know. But we're gonna go full hinting. Color, we're gonna leave white. We're not gonna justify to left. I like to justify my text to the center. I'm not gonna mess with any of the spacing or anything like that, indentation or letter spacing or anything like that. On my version of Gimp, the text box, tends to fluctuate from dynamic to fixed. Dynamic basically fits to your text, and fixed is just a set box. I don't know why this is a feature, it just is, but you'll notice that when I start typing, it defaults back to fixed. Don't worry, you can just switch that to dynamic and it'll fit to your text. So now that we have our text, we're going to exit out of our text box. We're going to grab it with our move tool and we're going to center it. This is just what I like to do. You don't have to do this. What I also like to do is right click, alpha to selection, which is basically since everything in between the letters is transparent and the letters themselves are not transparent, alpha to selection basically is whatever is visible, right? So if there's any transparency, it's not going to select that. It's going to select whatever is visible. So I like to go alpha to selection, layer, crop to selection. Now you're going to notice when I do this, the little ants crop to the borders of whatever is visible, like this. So now our selection is everything that's visible, and basically the border touches the outside of our selection. It's not going to go on the inside. We already have that selected, but basically this is your this is the size of your layer, basically. So we're going to go select none. I like to reposition it because, as you can see, it's off center. So if you're doing something that's really intensive in terms of precision, you're going to want to do this basically every time. I'm really anal when it comes to stuff like this because I really enjoy doing graphic work and making sure that it's perfect, even though I'm not the best at it. But you absolutely don't have to do this. So I'm just going to recenter this. Now, if we want to do 3D text, basically what it is a motion blur, and you're merging the blurred layers. Now I'm going to show you what I mean. So for this example, we are going to make a new layer. Now I know I just cropped our layer to this selection, but I'm basically just going to undo that. Again, this is just to go through the paces and show you what I do typically. So I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to merge this layer down. You can just right click and merge down. So now, instead of it being our text as our layer, it's actually the full page, and you can see that when you move it. So you can see the boundaries of our selection are no longer the text, it's actually the whole canvas, that 1280 by 720 size. Now, again, I'm not an expert. I haven't taken any classes or anything like that. Everything that I do, I've been self-taught. So if you're confused, let me know down in the comment section below, but let's go ahead and move on. I'm going to take away my guides because I don't really need them for right now. I'm going to right click our text, alpha to selection, which again selects what is visible. I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to move this layer behind our example. You can leave it in front. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this with black. So I'm going to go to my fill tool and I'm going to switch the white to black with these little arrows here. I'm going to fill in the outline of our text with black. Then I'm going to select none. So this doesn't take over the text that we have. It just creates a new selection from what we had, and you fill it in black. So this example layer I'm going to delete because we don't really need it anymore. That was just for the purposes of an example. Now our text, I'm going to put it in front and I'm going to make it invisible. So I'm going to click this little eye icon that basically makes a layer invisible. It's still there, it's just you're not looking at it. Now that we have our example text and then what's going to be our 3D shadow or drop shadow, whatever you want to call it, I'm going to select this layer, then I'm going to go to filters, blur, and the way that we're going to do perspective is motion blur. We're going to go to motion blur, make sure that linear is selected. Just for this example, we're going to do another example with zoom to get sort of a perspective sort of off in the distance, sort of like a vanishing point or focal point. But for this example, we're just going to do linear to one side. I already know what I personally use. I use a length of 20 and I use an angle of 220. Now in your preview box you can scroll around and see what that's going to look like. So we're just going to center our little preview box on our text. So you'll notice that if you change the angle, it changes basically where the shadow is going to go. So play around with this basically to fit your own purposes, but I know just for this example I'm going to do 20 and I'm going to do an angle of 220. So that's just down and off to the side. Click OK. And then there's your motion blurred shadow, basically. So this is what it looks like just with one motion blur. If you want to, you can leave it like that, but we're gonna go a little bit further. We're gonna make this shadow solid. So we make this invisible. Now the way that you make this motion blur solid is basically by duplicating the layer over and over again and then merging those layers. Now to duplicate a layer, you go over here to your layers toolbox and select the button that says duplicate layer. So I like to do this over and over again until it's really solid and I don't see any more changes. So you're gonna see as I click duplicate layer, it's gonna become more and more solid and less blurry. So let's go ahead and do that. Now to merge all of these, I can just right click and select merge visible layers. Now if you do this while this is visible or your background is visible, obviously it's pretty self-explanatory. It's going to merge all the visible layers, so you want to make sure that anything you don't want to merge together obviously is not visible. So we're going to select merge visible layers, go ahead and merge, do it again, merge visible layers, merge, do it again, merge visible layers, merge. So this is pretty solid. It's not blurry anymore, so it's fair to say that I don't have to keep doing this process again. Now if we make our example text visible again, you can see what it looks like with the little perspective. Now we can leave it at that, or we can add sort of a gradient on the shadow, if you will, in the back. Now basically all you do is motion blur your top layer again over this bottom layer, and then you sort of grain merge it down. So let me show you what that looks like. I don't want to lose this example in case I mess it up, so I'm going to duplicate this, and then it'll say example copy. We're going to keep that, make this invisible, and we're going to save it for later. So I like to just move it down to the bottom. Now our example copy, we've already done one motion blur, and Gimp lets you repeat that. So we're going to go back to filters. We're going to repeat motion blur. Now our top layer is blurry just like our bottom layer was blurry beforehand. So if we decide that we're good with this and we want to sort of merge this down with the bottom layer, you can just click example copy, or that's what it's called, whatever it's called for you. Click our layer that we just blurred. Now in our mode, this is going to allow you to do a bunch of different things. You can do dissolve, you can do lighten only, screen. All of these do various different things, so mess around with them and whatever looks best for you. I'm going to go down to grain merge, which merges the two layers, and then I'm going to set my opacity to something like 60, and then I'm going to make our copy of, or our original copy of our example text visible again, and move it up to the top and see how that looks. So you can see it adds sort of an actual perspective, like sort of shadowy look. And that's very basic. We only motion blurred our example copy one time, and it's already looking pretty good. But if you want to get a little bit more advanced, what I've noticed is that you can do this in multiple ways. Now this involves changing our example layer shadow to a lighter color so that you can add a white to black gradient, so to speak, over it. No, so I'll just show you how to do that. Now it's not anything different, so if you get confused, just slow this part down or pause it and just look at what I'm doing. It's not anything different except for maybe cutting and motion blurring different parts. We're gonna make our bottom layer invisible. We're gonna right click alpha to selection. Now again, that's basically this outline, and I'm gonna make another layer and fill it with black. And then we can make a copy of our example layer since it's already white. Make our example layer invisible, save it for later. So this is our text, and here's our drop shadow. Now these are two copies of our example text. Let's go ahead and go to select none. So this is basically just our text in a black and a white version. Now what I'm gonna do, since I am in the habit of doing this, and you'll find out, you know, soon enough on your own that you might want to do this yourself, is I'm going to alpha to selection our sort of 3D shadow, and I'm going to change that color to something lighter than black, because if you try and make a white to black gradient, it doesn't really make sense to have your base color in the background black. You want it something lighter so that the black stands out. I hope that makes sense. So we are going to basically go to our color over here, and I'm going to click on black, and then I'm going to make like a nice, let's do a sort of gray. I'll go a little bit lighter than I normally do, just so you can see the gradient effect, but in reality you probably want to do something darker. We're going to select OK. With our fill tool, our little bucket tool selected, we're going to go ahead and fill this with gray. Go ahead and go to select none. So now our drop shadow, as you can see, is gray. So now that we have that, we can make it invisible, and we're gonna motion blur our example copy in white and our example copy in black, each individually. But the way that we do this to make sure that they're not going the same way is we're going to alpha to selection, and we're gonna move our selection just slightly to the left with the white one and slightly down with the black one, so that we have two separate directions with two separate colors. And if that sounds kind of confusing, I don't really know how to explain it any better, so I'm just going to show you. So with our example copy, we go to our move tool. As long as we have this selected, we're going to click just so it's the move tool recognizes that we want to move that, and then with our arrow keys we can go right 2. You can go right 3, but it might be over a little bit. You can go right 1, it might not be enough. So we're gonna go right 2, 1, 2, and then we're going to delete that. Basically meaning, when we select none, this is what you have. This is what you have left over. So this is our white. This is what it looks like on the sort of drop shadow that we have. Now we're gonna do the same thing, alpha to selection on the black version, move tool, click it once, and we're gonna go down 2, and then delete. Select none. So now we can see we sort of already have a false perspective, has the illusion of perspective. If we take this away, it almost looks like, you know, 3D already. It looks like, you know, if there was a light over here, you would have the shine on one side and then the shadow on the other side. So that's basically the illusion we're going for. Now what we want to do is motion blur these, and then we're going to combine them just like we did making this layer. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Filters, repeat motion blur. Now you don't want to go crazy and make this super solid because it might not blend very well, but if you make the bottom visible, you can already see that it has that sort of lighting effect. So let's go to our black layer, filters, repeat motion blur, and now we can see it sort of already has this 3D sort of effect. So let's move our example layer, let's make it visible and move it all the way up to the top. And so already it's looking pretty good, but we can make it more severe if we want to. And again, basically that's duplicating the shadowed layers and then merging them all together. So it looks something like this. So select your motion blurred section. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right click, merge visible. And then I actually messed up because I didn't make the darker one invisible, so let's undo that. We're gonna undo, just Control Z, all of the other ones. I'm gonna make this invisible. We're gonna make this invisible. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right click, merge visible layers. Go to our black one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right click, merge visible layers. So when we make them both visible, we can already see basically the drop shadow is sort of outlined with the lighting effect, or the false lighting effect. So when we make it visible, the reason we originally wanted this to be gray instead of black is because if this was black and then our shadow or sort of lighting effect was also black, you wouldn't see it. Also, the sort of white side of our lighting effect would be really it would contrast it like a lot more, and it just wouldn't look realistic. So you want it to be subtle, but you also want it to be noticeable. So just mess around with that and sort of fine tune it however looks good to you. So let's make our example text visible again, and then there you have it. Basically 3D text. So there's a noticeable difference between our white text and then our sort of grayish, but not totally gray like this layer is, sort of lighting effect, and then our darker sort of shadow effect on the bottom. Now if you don't want to do that, let's make these invisible. An easier and sort of cheat code way of doing this is go to your shadow or your perspective or your solid background, whatever you want to call it, alpha to selection, and you can make a gradient over it. I'm going to go ahead and show guides. You can go to view, show guides, and that'll make the guides appear. Select your gradient. I'm going to select black. I'm going to rotate these so that white is on top. Now over in your gradient, you can go from, instead of foreground to background, you can go to foreground to transparent, which I'll show you what that looks like. I'm gonna make a new layer. Let's make this invisible. Let's select none just for right now. So foreground to transparent, basically foreground, background. If we do foreground to transparent, it's gonna look like this. So that's whatever your foreground color is, and then gradient to transparent. Same goes for black. So the reason we want to do this is it's basically a different way of doing the perspective with the white and black layers that we made, but it's sort of a corner cutting way of doing it. So now that we have our new layer, we're going to go ahead and go to our shadow layer, alpha to selection. And what I like to do sometimes is sometimes I'll just do the whole thing, normal foreground to background gradient, sort of like this. Go to the top of your selection and go to the bottom, and it'll look like, sorry, I did that on the bottom layer. Let's Control Z that. Make sure you have this selected, by the way. So let's go to the top of our selection all the way to the bottom. It'll look something like that. So if we go to select none, and then we move this down, here's our top layer. Here's our drop shadow layer. Let's move this down further. We're in between our light and our shadow. So here's our gradient that we just made, and here is our sort of solid shadow, if you will. Now if we take this and we can do opacity to 50%. That's what it looks like. So you have sort of a more natural, slow gradient, but it doesn't have the same effect as our light and shadow that we made. So here's with the white on, white off, black on, black off. Now, what you can do instead of doing opacity to 50 is you can go to mode like we did earlier, and you can grain merge, and that's what that'll look like. I like to do a little bit of both, and I'll just grain merge all of these. So it has a more, let's take away our guides. It has a more natural, if there was a light here, it'd probably look like that. If we take away our gradient, this is what it looks like. It's more of a simple, straightforward shadow design. But if we add back in our gradient, it has a more glowy look, I guess. Also, it's more smooth. If you'll notice, when you motion blurred the light and the shadow, let's zoom into about 200. You'll notice that it has these weird lines. I don't know why it does that. Maybe I need to update Gimp or whatever, but that's what it does for me. So if you throw this gradient over there, we might be able to move the gradient up and then merge all of these layers if we want to make it more smooth, basically. So we can also put the gradient over everything. We can put it in between the light and the dark, sort of make it more smooth. We could put it all the way at the bottom. It doesn't really matter. Another thing you can do is merge these down. Just make it go back to normal instead of grain merge. Let's do our gradient again, and we're going to put our gradient over the top of both of them. So it's sort of a more smooth transition, and that's what that looks like. So instead of all the lines, you have sort of a more smooth gradient. Now what we can do is, if we want to make sure that it's smooth-ish looking, we can merge visible layers, filters, blur, go to Gaussian blur, And then let's just do a blur of about 2 by 2. Let's see what that looks like. It looks a little bit more smooth. There's not as many lines. So let's go to 66%. This is basically how much you're zoomed in. Sorry if I didn't explain that. So let's go to 66%, and it looks a lot more smooth. We can even duplicate it and then merge those visible layers again if we want. Put it over our background. Make our regular text visible again. Go to normal grain merge. And then there you have it. That looks super duper smooth. So basically, if you're confused about any of that, just go back, and I haven't done anything new. I've just been doing what I've always been doing. If you want to add a border, you can alpha to selection your normal text. And either, the reason we're not gonna add a border straight to this, we wanna shrink it first, is because it's gonna look really stupid, and I'll go ahead and show you. Let's do a new layer. We're gonna do it behind our text layer. We're gonna fill it with black. But first, we're gonna go to select, grow. Let's do by 5. So that basically takes our selection 5 pixels in every direction away from our example text. Now, this is why you don't want to do it bigger than your text selection, is because it's gonna look like this. So it doesn't look very realistic because the black sort of, if you can see, goes over the shadow, and it doesn't look very realistic. So let's go ahead and undo that. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna shrink it. We're gonna go about, let's do 2 from the image border, so that's shrinking by 2 pixels. We're gonna invert this. Inverting basically means we shrunk this by 2, and then we inverted it to everything other than this being shrunk by 2. We're gonna make sure that our example text is selected, and then you can hit delete, or you can use the eraser tool, so that basically shrinks our text. Let's go to select none. So that's what it looks like. It looks like it already has a natural border. Now if you want to make that more defined, again, alpha to selection, go to our example layer. Now since we shrunk it by 2, we can just grow it by 2. So that's back to normal in our case. And then fill that with black, which will give us a sort of black border. You don't have to do that in that order. You can fill it in the background before you shrink it, and then shrink your text or whatever you want to do. It looks a little harsh to me, so we can repeat Gaussian blur a couple times to make sure that it blends well. Then we can go to grain merge, and that's pretty much it. So that's how you make 3D text. It looks kind of weird when you zoom in super close, so what you can do ultimately is merge visible layers and then scale it. So we're at about 575, so let's go to 450. Oh, another thing you want to do, let's go ahead and reset that, is make sure scale for me on my version of Gimp defaults to the width and the height being unlinked. That's gonna, it's gonna make it look weird. It'd be similar to if I just did this and it would look super like distorted. So you want to make sure that these are linked, unless you want it to look distorted. That's up to you. For our width, we're gonna scale down from 575. Let's go to 450. Let's bring our guides back, and then we're gonna center this. Take the guides away, and then I like to select background just so the little ants aren't there. And there's our 3D example text. If you were confused about any of this, let me know. I'll probably be doing more videos like this in the future since I really like it. Hope you guys enjoyed. Leave a like if you did. Again, let me know down in the comments below if you're confused about any of that. Hopefully I could clear it up. Subscribe for all of my newest content drops. This is actually the first video like this I've ever done. So if you're into this sort of thing, definitely let me know. You guys have been great. I have been the Danger Moss, and I will see you next time.